Hello and welcome to this week's Innovate Queensland GRID webinar. GRID is for Giving Research and Ideas Direction. My name is Leanne Wyville and my business is Presence Communications. I'm working with Impact Innovation to deliver the Innovate Queensland program, which supports the Queensland Government's Advanced Queensland initiative. Today's webinar is about grant writing. Impact Innovation's Managing Director, Brian Ruddle, will be sharing some tips about preparing grants from the perspective of what grant assessors expect to see to help them make a decision. Now, just while we are waiting for other people to connect to the webinar, I'll go through some of the tools we'll be using for those people who haven't viewed a webinar with the Citrix GoToWebinar system before. So on your screen, you should have a slide that looks something like this. So you've got the slide, my screen, and then you'll have a control panel, usually to the right-hand side, and a little button up there, which allows you to reduce it if you need to. So this is your control panel, and if you want to keep it on for the whole time, make sure you go up here into the View section and uncheck the auto hide control panel so that you always have that with you. The next thing I'd like to show you is your actual control panel and some of the features there. Oop, looks like I ran one too far, sorry. Here we go. So on your control panel, you should see a little little button there with a hand, and there may be times in the webinar where Brian will ask you to raise your hand. So what you do is you just click on that button, and that way we'll know that you've been able to answer the question. If you have a question for us, please type it into this box, listed questions. What we're going to do today is collect your questions and then do a Q&A session at the end. But whenever the question occurs to you, by all means, please type it in, and we'll go through all the questions that our time allows for at the end. Because Brian's got quite a lot he wants to cover today, and the best way to do that is let him go through the slide presentation and then we can answer your questions. But type them in at any time. Also, please download the handouts. It's important that you download those during the webinar and certainly before we exit the webinar. Brian has kindly put a copy of his slideshow as a handout, and there's some other information there about a forthcoming webinar, about the Impact Innovation Group and about Innovate Queensland. So remember to download the handouts. You can start that now. Or do it sometime through the presentation. Okay. So now I'm going to hand the screen over to our webinar presenter, Brian Ruddle. Brian is the Managing Director of Impact Innovation Group, and he leads a team of specialist innovation and commercialisation practitioners based in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and China. Since founding the company in 2006, Brian has developed innovation systems for all size enterprises, from small businesses to multinationals. Working closely with governance boards and senior managers, he helps derive value from innovation programs and commercialisation efforts, turning ideas into assets. Brian draws on more than 2 decades of experience across Asia, Africa and the Pacific, and he is a regular speaker at innovation conferences in Australia and overseas. He's worked in such sectors as health, education, mining, agriculture, finance, trade and water. Brian's also participated on numerous assessment panels, helping government and private investors evaluate which proposals are likely to deliver the best outcomes for the funds available, and that's commercially, economically and socially. So I'm now going to hand the screen over to you, Brian. Let's hope you're ready. Let's go.
Yeah, no, thanks. Here we go. I'll just show my screen, and so hopefully that'll come up in a moment, Leanne. But thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everyone. With the presentation today, we're going to be focusing a lot on grants, but a lot of the approaches that we're going to be talking about also apply when you're actually putting tenders together. So as Leanne sort of outlined in the intro, I've done a lot of work on both sides of the grant sphere, if you like, both in terms of preparing grant applications, but then also sitting on assessment panels. And I suppose through that, getting a lot of insights into what makes a good grant application and what drives grant assessors insane. So with today's presentation, we'll sort of cover off, and there's going to be a lot of, if you like, questions, I suppose, that I'll sort of step through. But I've set the presentation up like this so that you can essentially use some of the material that we'll go through as a bit of a checklist next time that you're putting a grant together. What I might do is I'll just shut down the video, the webcam, just so that the slides go through a bit better and just sort of save some of the jerkiness when we're going through the presentation. But Leanne, if you can remind me at the end, I'll turn it back on when we do the questions and answers.
Certainly will. Thanks, Brian.
Okay. So in terms of the presentation, there's 6 main areas that we're going to go through. So the first is sort of understanding the assessment process. Then we're going to be looking at compliance and whether you're compliant for a particular grant. The application itself, and then about how you build out your story around the grant, the approach and methodology, and then picking up on budgeting, management, and sustainability. So just the first thing to really think about and to understand when you're first looking at a grant is to understand that it's not just a grant. What you're trying to do is to understand the people that are actually going to be doing the assessment. And so part of it is when you're assessing these grants is you're sort of perceiving risk around what the grant applicant is trying to achieve and what they can actually deliver. And so on this slide, it covers a number of things that I suppose I tend to look at when I'm assessing grants. What's the likelihood that, they're going to be able to deliver on time and on budget? What's my gut feel about their approach? Does it make sense? Do I think it's actually going to work? Am I comfortable with the team? And does the grant actually demonstrate that the team can actually deliver the particular project or program? Can the associated team then and the organisation manage unexpected problems? And essentially the last one there is, will they let me down? Particularly, say within government agencies, when, say, it's a restricted program, there's only so many, so much in way of funds available. If I sort of give a grant fund to someone, and will they let me down and actually make the whole program look bad? And so they're the sorts of things that are going around the brain of assessors when they're looking at these grant applications. The other thing to understand is the decision-making process. So normally you've got 3, 4, 5, 6 people around the table at particular points in time, whether it's part of moderation or just doing the assessment together, and they're essentially working off scoring sheets. And so it's really important when you're preparing grants to understand those scoring sheets, or the criteria at least, if you're not given the percentages that the assessment's going to be made on. Because at the end of the day, the assessors are comparing their opinions against other assessors as well. And so there's actually a fair bit of discussion that goes on. So you need to understand that sort of decision-making process there. The other things I'll cover off in terms of what makes assessment difficult is when we get grant applications coming across the table and they're very difficult to read. And I sort of put in there sort of difficult to understand as well. When there's a lot of jargon, when it's not a well-written application, when it's too wordy, So I've given the example there, reviewing 50 applications. Some grant programs get 300-400 applications. When you've got a badly written application or it's very difficult to understand, it makes it very difficult for assessors who are going through all these things. You know, if there's not enough information there, the wrong information against categories, particularly when you've got a scoring sheet and as an assessor you're trying to go through and put scores against particular categories and the information's not in the right places. And finally, the questions aren't actually answered. So these might seem very logical, but you know, I might as well use some of the tools here. But if we can do a bit of a hands up using the that hands up function, but if we get a hands up in terms of how many people have actually sat on assessment panels that are here, we'll just sort of see what comes up. A few there, but not an awful lot compared to sort of the numbers that are there. And this is something that I recommend to a lot of people, is to, when you're interested in actually putting grants in, is to actually try to get and sit on some assessment panels, because it gives you a completely different insight into what assessors are looking at, and what it's like to actually see a lot of these these grants coming across the table, and what works and what doesn't work. It's a great thing to get involved in. You know, often thankless when you do get those 50 applications, but it's a great thing to give you those insights. So let's move on to preparing a grant. So that was sort of covering off on some of the things from the assessor's side. But when you actually start having a look at a grant, there's a few things that we tend to step through to work out whether we're actually going to go forward. Because you shouldn't actually apply for all grants. And so some of the key things that we've found in the fine print that we're glad we've picked up early are audit requirements. So we've seen some grant applications come through with the requirements that you need audited accounts, for example, for 3 years. If you don't have audited accounts, it's a question of whether you want to put the time and effort into getting those to become compliant. Time in operation is another one. Do you comply with that? Provision of just general accounts and whether you're comfortable as an organisation providing those accounts. Mandatory insurance requirements, and even location of head office, particularly with state-based grants. And throughout this presentation, I'll talk very broadly about different types of grants rather than being specific. But Queensland government grants, just as a quick example, you do need to essentially, with most of them, be based in Queensland or have the head office or the main office in Queensland to comply with a lot of these. And so, if you don't comply with these requirements, and there's a lot of other ones as well, you need to stop and really assess whether you want to go ahead with the grant application. The other thing is around compliance is around instructions. And this is a really difficult one because we've seen a lot of grant programs where they're very, very specific about the requirements around the number of words, number of pages, font sizes in some cases, or types of font as well. Particularly when you start getting into tenders and everything, it gets very prescriptive at times. Number of copies, so often you still need to deliver hard copies at times. Who has to sign? And then, of course, submission times. And I suppose the key reason I put this in the slide deck is that these small things can actually make you non-compliant. There's nothing worse than actually submitting a grant application, hoping for the best, putting in all the effort, and then actually getting the kickback saying, sorry, you're not compliant. Look, I'm putting some of these things up here from experience and sort of being hit by them because, you think that, they're saying 10 pages, it doesn't matter if you go over a paragraph. They haven't worried about that before. But then all of a sudden you've got a different assessment group and they've decided that collectively, you're not compliant, therefore they're going to kick you out because they've got so many applications. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind about how far you're prepared to push the boundaries around the actual specific requirements in the instructions for a particular grant application. So let's look at the application itself. And with this, and again, it's very generic, but essentially most grant applications have a section wanting to know about your organisation, previous experience, and then it starts looking at, well, what's the project? How are you going to implement the project? The people that you're going to have involved, and then also the budget. So just using these generic areas, I suppose the first area we'll talk about is around your story, which is really around this sort of thing around the organisation and your previous experience. So with the story, when we start actually building the story around a particular grant application, and with most grant applications, it is on a competitive basis of some sort, whether it's just because there's a limited amount of funds or they're only limiting the number of applicants that are going to get up. So before we actually start bringing together a grant application, we generally have a whiteboarding session about our competitors. And that really sort of starts to focus in on, well, who else do we think is going to be applying for this particular grant program? How are they going to be approaching it? Now, in a lot of cases, we don't know specifics, but we have a bit of a feel for the types of groups that are going to be having a go. And even if we sort of categorise them based on size of the organisations, it could be their sectoral focus and things like that. It's really starting to get a bit of a feel for who are the competitors and what sort of angles are they going to be taking with the grant. Their approach to the problem or the approach to, providing a particular program or whatever the grant's around. And so it's interesting when you start to take that approach of looking at competitors or potential competitors around the grant, it then all of a sudden becomes clearer about how you can make your actual application more compelling. So let me give you an example of this. So when putting a grant application together, you might sort of identify that you've got a competitor or potential competitor, I should say, that has got experience in implementing similar projects before. Let's say this grant is to do some stuff in regional Queensland. They've got experience in regional Queensland. They might have team members that are based out in regional Queensland. And so you've sort of looked at, you might be an organisation that's based in let's say it's down the Gold Coast, and you're looking at how you can make a mark or how you can make your application compelling. And so through that, you might say, okay, well, we've got all of these skills. We've done it all before, or we bring this unique approach. We've got these groups that we're sort of going to be competing against. Maybe we need to collaborate. And this is where sort of clever collaboration can come in, where you might say, well, actually, there's this other group out in regional Queensland that have these other aspects. We bring this other, component to the grant. If we come together, then actually we're going to be a very, very compelling case. And so that's where the value of looking at your competitors comes into play, because you start to actually build out a more compelling application. The other thing that we often look at is sort of what are the risks of picking us? What are the high risk, are we going to be high risk or low risk? And so we do a lot of introspective looking at our consortium, what we bring to the table, and whether we sort of work together and things like that. And so probably one of the key things about risk is often people bring together consortiums or groups of companies for particular grants. There's actually a risk around that in terms of how they're going to work together. If you can demonstrate that you've worked together before, then the risk goes down. If you can demonstrate that your organisation organisation has got all this experience in implementing similar programs, and the team that is in this particular grant application is the same team that was involved in those previous programs, the risk goes down. So it's really important to sort of look at this high risk, low risk, because that's what the assessors are really looking at when they're assessing the grants. The other one there is about demonstrating that you can effectively deliver the outcomes. And a lot of that's through past experience, but then, as I said with the team, if you can demonstrate that you've got the same team that's done this in the past, it comes across really well. Do you meet all the selection criteria? Again, we often state this, that we do. And again, it's making it really easy and clear to the assessors so that it makes it easy for them to do their scoring. So if you're using words and making it very easy for them to assess your grant and that you do tick all the selection criteria, it makes a world of difference. And finally, when we're building around this story about our who we are and what our capacity is, again, looking introspectively is that, well, would we back ourselves? If it was our money and we were handing it out, would we back it? And again, that's where it's a case of sort of really looking at what that story is that we're trying to present and making sure that it's compelling. So the second part there of the application is around, the project, the people, the budget. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'd sort of term it getting the job done. So with getting the job done, the way that we tend to look at it is from an approach perspective and a methodology perspective. Now, what we mean by this is the approach is really about how we're going to go about approaching implementation of the project. How are we going to ensure that we meet the time and the budget constraints? How are we going to communicate with the client, the investor or the grantor, and how are we going to manage risk? And so essentially what we tend to do is we put in a section that talks about how we essentially translate all of our experience that we've outlined in previous sections about our story into this particular program. And so our approach, for example, might be that we have a management team that will be meeting with the client on a monthly or a quarterly basis. Another approach could be that when we start to identify any technical issues, this is how we will approach trying to resolve those particular technical issues. When it comes to acquitting funding, if that's a major part of the grant program, this is our approach to acquitting funding. And so it's a general approach about how we go about implementing the program. The methodology, on the other hand, is actually more specific. So these are the activities that you will undertake to deliver outcomes. And the best way I've ever found of describing this, it's like a recipe. So if you ever look in a recipe book and it says, okay, you need all of these ingredients, first step, you get your bowl out, you put the flour in. Then you go and put the milk in, then you do the eggs, then you do this. And essentially that's what the methodology is about. So taking a slight step to the right about looking at assessors again, when we're assessing grant applications, we're wanting to have comfort that the organisation that's submitting the grant knows what they're going to do. And often with these, and it depends on the type of grant program, it's even getting into some really granular stuff for what's going to happen during the first 2 months. When you first get the contract, it might be we're going to have the initial meeting. Out of that meeting, we're expecting to get this sort of information. We're then going to go and travel to such and such a place. We're then going to go and do this and that. And sort of really getting into that so that it's very logical and believable in terms of we know what we're going to do. just sort of with this whole thing of approach and methodology, and this is sort of feeding into probably the methodology a bit more, is really making sure that there is that logical project structure. So if there are different components or different aspects of the project that you're going to be implement, call them different components and describe how those components interrelate. Talk about the activities or the tasks that you're going to undertake under each of those components. Talk about the outputs that are going to occur, and more importantly, the outcomes that are going to occur. And so if you have a logical project structure, it actually makes it really easy then to get the feel that, yes, this organisation knows what they're on about, and I've got comfort as an assessor that if we hand the money over to them, that they're going to be able to implement this. As I said before, it needs to be granular. You need to get down into the nitty-gritty. We've seen, well, I've seen a lot of grant applications, essentially, and particularly in social, on the social side, where it's a public good. It's sort of like, we're going to do this, and we've got all, we've got this experience. It's a really worthy idea. Please fund us. And the problem is that that sort of approach is up against other grant applications that go into this whole granular. Yeah, we've got this idea how we're going to help a particular part of society, and this is what we are going to do. And so the granular approach actually gives a lot more confidence that the grant funds are going to be used effectively. Being specific about personnel and other resources is really important. So again, instead of wafty statements like the team is going to do X, Y, and Z, be very specific that our technical manager is going, John Smith is going to do X, Y, and Z. We've got a project manager, Jane, and she's going to do this. And again, using people's names, because again, you've already often put in the experience of the people. It's their experience that's going to actually drive the outcomes by implementing these activities. And so, again, if it makes it very clear as to how those people are involved, you get a lot more confidence that the deliverables are going to occur. Gantt charts is another one. Breaking up some of my voice, if we just do a quick hands up. In terms of Gantt charts, in terms of putting grants together, if you can just do a hands up, those who don't put Gantt charts in all the time. And we're getting a couple there. So look, the Gantt charts is something that, click through. Let me go to this next one. Sorry about that. And go there. Gantt charts is something that I sort of find really important. This is just an example Gantt chart. But even very simple ones, as soon as you start to put time frame against tasks or activities, all of a sudden you get a better feel for whether this is actually going to work in terms of the project approach. As soon as you sort of put in that, okay, we're going to travel around, let's use the hypothetical, we're going to travel around 5 major centres around Queensland to implement this particular program. And in the Gantt chart, all you see is that there's going to be travel over a 2-week period. All of a sudden, you're going, okay, how's that going to happen with that team? So from an assessor's perspective, Gantt charts tell you a lot. Often people sort of see them as a bit of a throwaway. I suppose, again, I tend to look at them fairly carefully because, again, it gives me that confidence about whether I think their plan is going to work. They've got the resources there to be able to implement the plan. They understand how long things take, which, again, is a really, really important part of it all because you need that realism around how long things actually do take. So let's have a look at then management and monitoring and evaluation, which is another really, really important part of grant applications. It's sort of, who's going to be responsible for ensuring outcomes are achieved? Do they have the necessary time and experience? So putting forward that the CEO of your organisation is going to be responsible for monitoring, sometimes you sort of look at that and think, well, yeah, sure, are they going to have the time? So you need to be able to demonstrate that if that's your strategy, how they're going to have the time, and more importantly, how they're going to do it. It's not just that, oh yeah, the CEO is responsible, it's how they're going to actually make sure that it all occurs. How the project team's going to work together. Again, we see a lot of this with grants where people just say, here's our team, without explaining how that team is going to work and how their skills are going to be maximised to deliver. How we're going to provide relevant data on progress. So, what data we're going to capture, how we're going to capture it is also very important. How are you going to identify and manage risks? So a lot of grants, they get really edgy about identifying risks, whereas we tend to take the approach, we're better off actually putting down that we see these as being really key risks in terms of implementing this program. And these are our strategies for overcoming and managing those risks. And if they occur, this is what we're going to do. We're going to monitor it this way in terms of making sure we pick up on additional risks. All of that actually gives you a lot more confidence when you're assessing grants, that they know what they're doing and they understand that the future isn't predictable, that everyone's best laid plans will go pear-shaped at some time. And so I really encourage you to make sure that you do sort of build in risks and how you're going to manage them. And then how you're going to collect data and report on outcomes. And particularly how it feeds into the funder's monitoring and evaluation system. So something else to keep in mind is that organisations, government agencies and other groups that provide grants also have to report to their, whether it's higher up in government, say ministers, or whether it's other groups, they have to report to someone about the performance of the grant program. And so if you're collecting data that's relevant to them and feeding into their monitoring and evaluation system, the whole thing starts to fit together. And again, when you're assessing grants, you get a better feel that they're actually there and it's not going to be a difficult project to manage because they're trying to help the grant agency as well. So touching on budgeting. Again, we see budgeting as being often superficially done in a lot of grants. It's often a one or a two-liner, three-liner sort of thing. And it's very difficult to match the budget to the project plan. The more that you can actually demonstrate how the budget fits with the project plan, the more confidence the grant assessors have that you haven't undershot it. So what I mean by that is that you just haven't put in a figure and that you've understood what the resources are, the timelines are, and that the budget actually aligns well with those. Picking up on that, resource allocations and timeframes, are they believable? And so the key thing there with that one and also the budget amount is what are the assumptions that you've made? And sometimes, and again, it depends on the format for the grant application itself, but if there's an opportunity to actually list out your assumptions, sometimes it's worthwhile. It depends on the time frame. If you're talking about implementation over 2 or 3 months, probably not as important because you can actually predict a little bit more about what's going to happen over that time frame. But if you're talking about over 12 months, 24 months, 3 years, often building out your assumptions about how all that works, again, just gives that bit of believability about, what we know and what we're just making an educated guess on. The basis for those assumptions is useful at times. And then also what happens if your assumptions are wrong? How are you going to manage all of that? So the final thing I just wanted to cover off is on sustainability. I suppose I'm a bit of a fan of sustainability having to be built in during the project stage. Often in grant applications, it talks about sustainability, and sustainability is this little section down the back of the grant program, and there's a few paragraphs that are thrown in there about how at the end of the project the organisation is going to do X, Y and Z for it to be sustainable. I actually tend to take a different view that you need to actually build in sustainability up front. So the project, when you're implementing it, you need to be implementing it with sustainability in mind. It's not just an afterthought. So part of this is sort of, why is the funding required? Can the project proceed without this grant or investment? And it's sort of starting to talk about that you need the grant funds to undertake this particular component of the project, and then this is how you're going to be sort of working on other components to build in the sustainability. It needs to be believable as to why the grant's required. If it's not believable and there's other more, it might be that you've got a very, very good project idea, but then if you're saying that, yep, we've got all these funds already available, and there's another group that have got the equally good project idea and equally good application, and they really need these funds to do this key bit of de-risking to be sustainable, they may have a bit of a better chance. So it's about wording, it's about approach with these things. Who else might fund it? What happens to the project when the grant investment is acquitted? And this is the key sustainability thing, that you need to build that into your project plan. How soon before it becomes self-funded as well is really important. And who could you collaborate with to ensure that the project's got some some future funding? So sustainability, it's an interesting one, but it's a very difficult one, and but it's critically important because again we've all seen projects that after 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 2 or 3 years, that funding stops and everything falls off. It's really important to sort of really seriously look at sustainability and what you can do with other funds and why this grant is really important to de-risk particular components of what you're trying to achieve. So with that, Leanne, I might hand back over to you and answer questions that have started to come through.
Thanks, Brian. Look, that's an excellent overview and even some nitty-gritty very helpful tip for grant writing. We do have a number of questions that are coming through. One that we have straight away came through very early on was, how do you get to sit on an assessment panel? Kim would like to know how she could or he could get onto the assessment panel.
Yep, the key one is that you can't apply to sit on assessment panels that you'll be going for grants for, obviously. But what it is, it's being aware of other grant programs around or other programs that are coming through, or tenders for that matter as well. So as I said at the start, a lot of tender assessment processes look at very, very similar things. So if there's a tender that's out that you're not going for, and you know say the government agency, or the other group that's involved, they often invite external assessors to be part of assessment programs. So it's a question of sort of I suppose asking and sort of seeing trying to find those opportunities.
Thanks, Brian. I've got a question here from Camilla, and I suspect that Camilla applies for research grants. She's asking about the minimum metrics there should be to be able to apply for a grant, for example, numbers of publications. So what are the minimum metrics before going for a grant?
Yeah, look, particularly on the research front, it sort of, again, it depends on the funding body. So with some grant programs, again, particularly on research, they're looking more and more for collaborations across multiple groups or multiple researchers. And again, Look, I've been included in research programs and grant applications, and I think I've got all of about 2 publications, and they're not really scientific, I have to say. I think they're stretching that one. But it doesn't mean that they're not including me, because they're actually including me for other strengths. So from an individual perspective, I don't see it as a big issue. It's more looking at it from the assessor's perspective about, do they have confidence that as a team there's that collective knowledge and background in research that's going to be required to implement the project in particular that's being put forward.
Thanks, Brian. A comment that we've got here from Ross, there we go. Sorry, from Reed. Shouldn't sustainability also include any transitions to business as usual?
Yeah, again, it depends on the grant or tender or whatever it is. If that's the nature of the funding, then definitely. For others, they are sort of more standalone projects that are sort of slightly outside of one organisation. But yeah, so for example, I suppose we can use the example, Advancing Regional Innovation Program. So we've been involved with some of that. That's outside of just one individual group, and so it's not so much, it needs to feed into business, like the new business as usual, not sort of just feeding into the old business as usual, if that makes any sense. So it's a looking forward as to the structure around that particular program. And no, I'd agree. If it's a component of an existing organisation, it's then, how does that fit into the business as usual? Because that's what develops that or delivers that sustainability.
And Brian, we've got a question here from Luke. How do you tread the line in demonstrating that you need a grant, but you were not so small and risky to give a grant to?
Yeah, this is a really, really difficult one. And it's a really fine line. Part of it is making sure that there's the structure and confidence around what the project's about, number one. The second thing is demonstrating that the grant program itself is going to deliver information that will allow the mobilisation of other resources, whether that's mobilisation of additional internal resources, the potential to mobilise resources from the perspective of, say, paying customers, or other aspects around that. So that's probably the best way of trying to describe the connect there, because it is that whole thing of, if you come in and you say, okay, we've got all this money and we're fine, but hey, we want the grant, it makes it difficult for the assessors. But if it's there as a de-risking approach, and again, depending on the grant criteria, so this is a very broad comment, but if you take that approach, often that's the best way of demonstrating how the grant's going to really add a lot of value to your particular project or program.
I would agree with that, Brian, and I would say that the more you can demonstrate a benefit from the project that you're applying for the grant for, the more benefit that you can demonstrate. Why not have a grant for it if that's the best way to make it get up and running? Okay, a query from B. If you are unsuccessful applying for a grant, is it worthwhile contacting the funder, asking why you didn't get the grant and then applying again?
Yeah, in most cases, and look, most grant programs do offer this as a debrief. We always try to get a debrief, whether it's a grant or whether it's a tender. While we do a lot of this sort of work, we're not successful all the time either. Geez, I'd love to find someone that is. But it's all about learning and understanding why you didn't get up. Now, the dilemma with getting that feedback is that you might get feedback on one grant program and they'll tell you that your team let's say it was too experienced, in a particular area and not experienced in another area. So next grant, you go and fix that up, and then you get the complete opposite. And that's the dilemma, and this comes back to my point right at the start. There's understanding that when you're applying for a grant, you're actually pitching an idea or an approach to a group of people that may or may not have heard of you, that may or may not have a really good understanding as to what you're proposing. And so part of the process of writing the grant is to really keep in the back of your mind that you're trying to talk to people and communicate to these people in a way so that they can understand what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to propose. If you start to, again, think down into, well, who's types of people on the panel and what they might be thinking, you start to communicate slightly differently, and often you do get better outcomes that way.
Thanks, Brian. A comment by Robert, and asking for your opinion, with Gantt charts. They're very popular, they're very useful, they're well known, but these days where you've got people, particularly in software development, using agile methodologies, are there alternatives to Gantt charts that could be used, and would that be well received?
Yeah, you can. The issue is, okay, with agile, there's still a general structure around the agile approach. And so if you're going to take an agile approach, it's more demonstrating how you're going to manage agile rather than using agile as an excuse for not actually having a process. Because if it's a bit, otherwise it can come across a little bit like, trust us, we can make this happen, we're going to respond to what actually happens on the ground. And you can have the same, say with lean. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about, lean startups, lean approaches to commercialization. And sure, you've got experimentation and all those sort of things built in as well. But there's a process around how you do that. So even within a Gantt chart, you can describe an agile approach in terms of sprints and things along those lines, which then still demonstrates how you're going to be able to implement the project on time. So I've seen other people try to use other timeline approaches or just dispense with Gantt charts completely. And in some grant applications, you don't have the luxury of putting in a Gantt chart. There's actually not the format to do that. But I'm still, where you do have that opportunity to explain step by step how you're going to approach things, and essentially how you're going to drive outcomes. So that's really the critical part of this. It's how you're going to drive the outcomes. Gantt charts I still see as being quite useful for that.
Thanks, Brian. Just coming back to a similar question to one previously. If the business is perceived to be able to self-fund the project, is it even worth going for the grant? So that's something that Jeff would like to know.
Yeah, look, often it is, but it comes back down to the reason why. So if, because look, a lot of large organisations, large companies do pick up grants. And the reason they do that is because they pitch it in a way that they're trying something new that they think's going to work, but what they're wanting the grant for is to either bolster their funds if they're putting in co-contributions, or it's a way of de-risking, or whatever. As long as you can come up with the story around that particular project that makes sense, it's still worthwhile going for. If you're from a corporate perspective, or even from say a not-for-profit perspective, if you're saying that we want the grant so that we can go and build this, let's call it intellectual property, but whether it's an approach or build something that we're then going to take away and it's just going to help our organisation, often that's a little bit more of a difficult sell if it can be demonstrated that you probably do have the funds to go and do that yourself. So it comes back down to the story more than anything else, and how what you're proposing fits into the grant criteria.
If I could just weigh in on that too, Jeff. I had a client once who wanted to apply for a grant because she thought it would boost her reputation. She saw her competitors were getting grants and they were able to promote that they were getting these grants and achieving these great things. So while she could fund her project, she thought that if she got a grant, that it would just give her another reason to give her another content for her communications. Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting reason for applying for a grant. And, you know, she had a really good idea too, so she did. A question here from Satya in relation to letters of support. So, Brian,
yep.
From an assessor's point of view, how much leverage or weight is given to letters of support from partners in a research proposal? How much does it impact the decision?
Yeah, it depends on the scoring criteria in a lot of ways as to the weighting that we put on it when we're sort of doing the assessment. But it also depends on I suppose the wording of the letter as well, and the involvement. So if it's, let's do a hypothetical, let's say it was a letter of support that was saying that the idea that was being put forward was fantastic. You know, if this grant gets up, what we're proposing to do is to be part of some of the rollout in this particular area, et cetera, that sort of shows a really nice alignment and gives a lot of value, particularly if it makes sense from getting back to that sustainability perspective. If it's a letter of support to say that, oh, Brian's a really great guy, trust him sort of thing, you probably don't get that much value out of that as a letter of support. So with letters of support, I'm a bit of an advocate for them to be specific to the project. We often see people that put in a lot of grants just wheeling out the same letters of support each time. That's when you sort of start to think, well, you know, are they really supporting this particular project? Are they going to be, you know, there to sort of help get the outcomes that they're talking about? So I don't know if that really answered the question or not. I know, Leanne, have you got any comments there as well?
I agree with you, Brian. I think it's sort of what's in the letter and who the letter's from, rather than simply having a letter. I think that's certainly key to it. And if you're asking people for support, be clear about what you need from that support. And I know that I've had to draft letters on behalf of other people, and they've agreed to them and said, yep, that's exactly what I want to say. So, yeah, certainly support your view, Brian, about making sure it's relevant, a relevant letter. And just coming back to your previous point about Gantt charts, and you did mention that sometimes the grant doesn't allow, the grant application process doesn't allow charts and graphs and things. So Craig is querying, you know, what's the alternative when you can't put in a Gantt chart? How else can you demonstrate that you've really got a handle on what's happening when and how much?
Sure. So what we've done in the past is we might have component one. Component one is to do with, I don't know, setting up the management team, or whatever it is. So we just put it in words. Underneath that might be a dot point or a dash or something or other. We sort of say activity one, you know, the first thing we're going to do, and we just describe it in words. Over the first month, we're going to bring together our management team, the stakeholder team, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. You know, at the end of that, we're going to, you know, we need these resources, and this is what we're going to do. And so we just describe it in words. It gives the same sort of feeling. It just needs, I suppose, if you can't put in a Gantt chart with enough detail, then that's the alternative.
Thanks, Brian. And sort of similarly, Jenny's query is about inserting images into text boxes to augment the commentary, you know, the old a picture paints 1,000 words. And, you know, on every panel there's going to be people who are visual readers more than, you know, they like pictures rather than words. So from an assessor's point of view, how's that taken, do you think?
Yeah, look, again, it depends on whether you can do it. You know, if you're putting in a grant application using a Word document, again, taking into account all of those things I said at the start about, well, following the criteria, they might have specific numbers of pages per section and things like that. If you can put a diagram in there that explains things really well, it's fantastic. The problem these days is with a lot of grant applications are done online through web portals. Even doing the editing in there is problematic. So in a lot of cases we've written out all of the text, if you like, in a Word document because we can distribute that around to multiple people and get their comments and get changes and edits. And then we upload those paragraphs into the web form, and we just can't put diagrams in there. You know, the only other way of doing that, sometimes with those web forms, they allow you to put additional information in, as long as that, you know, and then, you know, potentially you can upload a Word document or a PDF. You can put diagrams in there, but you need to really make sure that from an assessor's perspective, they can see the relevance to the sections, because otherwise it becomes really difficult. Again, I get back to this thing that you've got 50 odd, you know, grants or 30 grants to assess. If it's really hard to find the information, it's really hard to give the scores. Oh, Leanne, still there?
Sorry, I've muted myself. I was just going to say, Jenny chose the words augment the commentary. I would think that if the picture really supports the argument and says it better than words, you could aim for it. But if you're just looking to put pictures in to show off, to look pretty, to fill space, then that's not really going to help your cause.
No,
Simon,
it needs to value, yeah.
Sorry, go on, Brian.
Oh, I just said, you're right, it just needs to add value.
Yeah. Okay. Simon says, regarding web portals, what do the assessors see as an output from that? Web-based, or is it output to a document? So if somebody loads up their application via a web portal, so, you know, what does it look like at the other end, at the other side?
Yeah, it depends on the portal. Sometimes you get, you know, you just get essentially downloads into a PDF, and then you can sort of have a review through that. Other times you're actually assessing in the web portal itself, which is a little bit problematic at times for long applications. For short applications, it's not a problem. It really depends. For me, particularly if I'm, and this is more for tenders rather than grants. For tenders, I actually prefer to have something in front of me because I'm actually comparing. You know, so in terms of a hard copy and comparing, because I'm having to make judgment calls on how one application is you know, comparing to another. Because with those ones, tenders in most cases, you're just looking for one winner. But yeah, with grants, it really comes back to what the approach is. Yeah, you just have to suck it up.
Thanks, Brian. Look, we've got one last question because we're right on time at the moment. This one again from B. I work with social enterprises in developing countries to develop sustainable businesses, which often applies for applying for grants all over the world. Do you know any particularly good grant search engines other than funds for NGOs?
I don't. For overseas programs at the moment, I used to actually be involved a lot with AusAid, World Bank, Asian Development Bank and all the UN agencies. So I used to actually implement a lot of projects overseas and design them. You know, those for not-for-profit not-for-profits, tapping into those is often very difficult unless they've got sub-programs that are run at the country level. Yeah, so sorry, I probably don't have a really good answer for you with that one.
Thanks, Brian, very much for answering the questions and for your webinar. Could I say to everyone one more time, remember to download the handouts before you leave the webinar. We've had a really good session, some excellent questions and discussion happening. And thank you everyone too who has sent us some notes expressing your appreciation for today's webinar. There will be a survey that will pop up when we're finished, and we really appreciate any feedback you can give us in that survey. We do have some more webinars coming up for this month, so stay tuned. If you have any further questions, pop them in the survey or contact us directly, Innovate Queensland. And we will be making this webinar available on the Innovate Queensland YouTube channel by the end of the week. Thanks again very much for your attendance. Thank you, Brian. And we'll see you online on the grid next time. Bye for now.